Folks around here say the fog rolls in like a living thing up in these Appalachian hollers, curling through the trees and swallowing sound until you're sure you're the only soul left on Earth. I'm Melvin, 61 years old, born and raised near Elkhorn City, Kentucky, and I've worked the same small sawmill since I was a boy. Most mornings, I get up before the sun, brew my coffee, and step onto the porch just to listen to the whip-poor wills and watch the ridgelines turn pink with daylight. I've always felt safe in these woods, like the hills held me close. But one night last spring made me question everything I thought I knew about the land that raised me. It was late April, after a stretch of rain that had left the creeks swollen and the air smelling of wet earth and moss. I'd stayed late at the mill to grease the blades, and by the time I headed home, a thick, milky fog had settled so deep I could barely see the hood ornament on my truck. The drive was slow, and I kept glancing at the trees pressing in on both sides of the gravel road, half expecting a deer to bound out. I'd almost made it to my turnoff when I noticed movement low to the ground, something bigger than any raccoon or fox, gliding across the road like smoke. I braked hard and rolled my window down, squinting into the fog. At first, all I could hear was the drip of water from the trees, but then a faint rustling came from the roadside brush. Out of the whiteness stepped the biggest bobcat I've ever laid eyes on, except its fur was jet black, sleek as oil, and its eyes glowed an eerie green under my headlights. It stared straight at me, head low, shoulders bunched up like it was ready to pounce. But it didn't move a muscle. Just stood there, breathing, and for a second it felt like it was studying me as much as I was studying it. My skin went cold all over, though the night was warm, and I felt pinned to my seat like a kid caught sneaking out after curfew. I've hunted and hiked these hills my whole life and never once seen a black bobcat. Folks talk about melanistic animals, rare creatures born darker than their kin, but I'd always thought that was just stories to make campfire tales more exciting. The way it locked eyes with me, not afraid, not aggressive, just aware, made me feel like I was trespassing somewhere I wasn't meant to be. I could see the steam of its breath swirling in the mist, mingling with the fog, and for one wild second I wondered if it was even real at all. Then it blinked, turned, and vanished into the trees so quiet you'd swear it had never been there. I sat there for a long minute, engine idling, hands trembling on the wheel. Eventually I eased the truck forward, creeping through the fog until my headlights finally picked out the familiar curve of my driveway. When I got home, I didn't bother unloading my lunch pail or checking the doors. I just poured myself a shot of bourbon and sat in the dark, listening for sounds outside. I still can't shake the feeling that cat was a sign or a warning. Now I drive slower on foggy nights, and sometimes I catch myself scanning the roadside, hoping and dreading all at once that I'll see those green eyes again. Sometimes I swear it's still out there watching me. The next one will send chills down your spine. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I went to check the fence behind the barn, or so I thought. My name's Lila, and I've lived all my 43 years here outside Norton, Virginia, on a patch of land my granddaddy cleared back in the 30s. I raise chickens, tend a small garden, and work part-time at the Dollar General up the road. Life out here is steady and plain, the kind of place where you measure the seasons by the smell of wood smoke, or the sound of spring peepers calling from the hollows. Nothing much surprises me anymore in these hills, where the air smells of pine and the nights are so quiet you can hear a possum tiptoeing across dry leaves. But the morning I'm about to tell you about still sits heavy on my mind. The sun was barely up, casting soft gold across the grass, and the ground was damp enough to soak through my old rubber boots as I made my way along the fence line. I'd noticed a few posts leaning the day before, probably from the hard winds we'd had all week. Birds were fussing in the treetops, flickers of red and blue flashing between the branches, and a woodpecker hammered away somewhere deep in the timber, like a distant clock counting down the seconds. The world smelled of wet earth and budding leaves, and I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. I was halfway around the back pasture when I spotted something odd caught between two strands of barbed wire, a mess of greyish fur, matted and tangled like it had been there a while. At first glance, I thought it might be a raccoon that got itself stuck, or maybe a possum, but as I stepped closer, my stomach gave a funny lurch. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. The creature was about the size of a small dog, but its body was strangely long and thin, covered in wiry, silver-grey fur that shimmered a little where the morning sun touched it. Its legs seemed too long for its body, jointed like a deer's but thinner, almost delicate. Its face was pointed and narrow, somewhat fox-like, but the ears were enormous, standing straight up like a mule deer's. What truly froze me to the spot were its eyes, big and round, almost human-looking, so dark they reflected my own face back at me, wide-eyed and pale. It wasn't dead. It was breathing shallow and making a soft, rhythmic whimpering sound that cut right through me. Its sides fluttered with each breath, and every few seconds it tried to pull free, but the barbs had caught its fur and skin, and tiny dots of blood marked the wire and dripped into the grass below. Part of me wanted to run back to the house, lock the doors, and pretend I'd never seen it. But something in those eyes stopped me. There was no wild rage or panic like you'd expect in a trapped animal. Instead, there was a kind of pleading, like it was asking me for help without making a sound. I should have fetched gloves or called animal control, but I couldn't leave it there. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped the pliers as I talked to it in a low voice, telling it now, easy. Its ears twitched with every word, swiveling like little radar dishes, as though it understood. When I finally worked the barbed wire loose, it collapsed onto the ground, trembling so hard its ribs rattled. For a single breathless moment it just lay there, eyes locked on mine, and I swear it felt like time stopped altogether. Then, in a sudden burst of motion, it sprang to its feet and bolted for the tree line, moving in this strange, loping gait that was half running, half hopping. The brush shivered where it disappeared, then fell still and silent. I stood there for the longest time, heart pounding, staring at the blood-speckled wire and the crushed grass where it had lain. When I finally found my voice, I called my cousin Roy, who's hunted these hills all his life. He listened quiet, then said I'd probably seen a coyote with mange or maybe a mangy fox. But I know better. No coyote ever looked at me like that. Those eyes were too knowing, too sorrowful, as if they carried secrets older than these mountains themselves. Now every time I walk that fence line, I catch myself glancing into the shadows, half expecting those big black eyes to be watching me from the undergrowth. To this day, I'm not sure what I saw. If you thought this was intense, wait until you hear the next story. It's unbelievable. Back in 1997, up in the ridges near Harlan, Kentucky, I was working as a game warden, patrolling a stretch of forest folks called Devil's Backbone. My name's Curtis, and I'd been on the job close to 10 years by then, used to long days and longer nights, chasing off poachers or tracking injured deer. I'd grown up in these same hills, so nothing in the woods ever rattled me too bad. But that spring, I came across something that stuck in my memory like a thorn ever since. It was early May, a cool morning, with mist hanging low among the poplars and the smell of damp leaves and rich earth all around. I'd been following up on reports of illegal turkey hunting, creeping along an old logging road, my boots squelching in the mud. Birdsong echoed through the fog, sharp and clear, and every now and then I'd hear a squirrel chatter overhead. I was coming around a bend when I noticed a cluster of tracks in the soft earth, right where a spring-fed trickle crossed the path. At first, I figured they were just turkey prints, but as I crouched down, my breath caught in my chest. These tracks were round, almost like a big cat's, but too large for any bobcat, and the claw marks dug deep into the mud, as if the creature was heavy. There was something off about the pattern, too. Like the animal had an extra toe, or a misshapen paw. I followed the tracks a ways into the trees, every sense prickling, my radio silent on my hip. The air felt different in there, cooler somehow, and the undergrowth closed in so tight I had to push saplings aside to squeeze through. About 50 yards in, I stepped into a small clearing, and there it was, a massive mountain lion, bigger than any I'd ever heard of in these parts, sitting back on its haunches like a house cat, its tail flicking slow as a metronome. But its fur wasn't the tawny gold you'd expect. It was pale, almost white, with faint grey stripes along its shoulders, and its eyes shone a pale amber, catching the weak sunlight that managed to filter through the canopy. It was staring straight at me, not snarling or crouching to pounce, just staring like it was deciding something. My pulse was thundering in my ears. Part of me wanted to reach for my service weapon, but the other part of me was struck dumb by how beautiful and utterly out of place it looked. Mountain lions hadn't officially been in Kentucky for decades, though rumors always floated around about sightings in the backcountry. I took a slow step back, whispering under my breath, trying not to provoke it. Its ears twitched, and it let out a low, breathy, chuffing noise I'd never heard from any animal before. The sound was soft, but it vibrated through my ribs like a distant drum. Then, as quiet as a shadow, it turned and slipped into the trees, melting into the undergrowth so completely you'd swear it had never been there at all. For a long moment I just stood there, shaking, feeling like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I finally walked back out to the trail, I looked for its prints again, but the mud showed only confused scuffs and broken leaves, as though the earth had tried to erase any trace of it. Back at the station, I reported what I'd seen, but my supervisor just gave me a look like he thought I'd been sniffing too much chainsaw oil. "Probably a big bobcat," he said. "But I know the difference. That thing wasn't any bobcat. I've been in those woods 1,000 times since, but sometimes, in the hush of dawn, I get the feeling those pale eyes are still watching me from somewhere deep in the trees. That was just the beginning. You won't believe what happened next." Last autumn, up in the Appalachian hills near Boone, North Carolina, I was tending my goats when something happened that I still can't explain. My name's Raylene, 52 years old, widow going on 12 years now, and I keep a small herd of dairy goats for cheese and soap I sell at the farmer's market. My place sits on the edge of the forest, where the trees grow so thick you sometimes feel like you're living on the edge of another world entirely. I've always believed that if you respect the land, it'll respect you back. But that day made me wonder if the woods don't keep secrets they'd rather we never learn. It was late afternoon, the sky burnished orange and purple with the kind of sunset you only see in October. The wind smelled of leaf mold and distant wood smoke, and my goats were grazing quiet in the lower pasture. I'd gone out to check on them because one of my does, Pepper, was acting restless all day, pacing the fence and bleating soft, like she knew something I didn't. As I was walking the fence line, counting heads, I heard the strangest sound rising out of the woods behind me, a low hum that almost vibrated in my chest like the drone of distant bees, but deeper and more musical. I turned around, expecting maybe a passing ATV or logging equipment, but there was nothing. The forest stood perfectly still, not a leaf moving, shadows stretching long between the trunks. That's when I saw it, a stag stepping out from behind a cluster of rhododendrons. Only it wasn't like any stag I'd ever seen. It was enormous, easily the size of a horse, with an impossibly broad rack of antlers that swept back like branches of an ancient tree. Its coat was dark, almost black, but dappled with silvery patches that shimmered when it moved. The eyes were the worst part. Deep, liquid brown, but shining with a strange intelligence, like they were reading every thought in my head. I froze, heart banging so hard I could hear it in my ears. The goats, usually noisy and curious, had all gone silent, huddled near the fence as if they'd been rooted to the spot. The stag took a slow step forward, lowering its antlers just slightly, Not aggressive, but cautious, as if testing my reaction. I wanted to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The humming sound rose again, gently pulsing, and I swear I felt it inside my bones, as if the creature was somehow singing without opening its mouth. For a moment the world seemed to narrow down to just me and that stag, like time itself held its breath. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the stag turned and slipped back into the trees, moving so quietly that the branches barely stirred. The humming faded with it, leaving nothing but the rustle of dry leaves. The goat slowly began to bleat again, and I realized my hands were trembling so bad I almost dropped the bucket I'd been carrying. When I got back to the house, I tried telling my sister about what I'd seen, but she just said I'd probably spotted a big elk passing through. But I've seen elk, and they sure don't look at you like they've known you your whole life. Now, when the sun starts going down, I keep my goats closer to the barn, and sometimes I catch myself scanning the shadows at the tree line, waiting for a flicker of black hide or those huge antlers among the rhododendrons. I keep thinking that stag was trying to tell me something. I just wish I knew what. This is nothing compared to what's coming up. Perguntar ao ChatGPT. People in these parts believe that if you hear your name called from the woods, you ought never answer back. My name's Jonah, and I've lived all my 38 years in a cabin near Marion, Virginia, up in a fold of the Appalachians, where the fog sits low in the hollows, and even the trees seem to whisper secrets. I work part-time as a handyman and help my cousin run his trout farm. And though the nights can get lonely, I've always found comfort in the hush of the hills. But last winter, something happened that made me think twice about how well I really know these mountains. It was one of those bitter January nights, the kind where the stars look sharp enough to cut you and the snow squeaks under your boots like dry leather. I'd gone outside around 10 to check the propane tank, since the wind had been howling all day and I didn't want to wake up to frozen pipes. The sky was clear, moonlight turning the snow into a shining sheet of silver, and my breath hung in clouds as I moved around the side of the cabin. Everything was so still I could hear the creek gurgling half-frozen in the gully below. I'd just finished tightening the valve when I heard someone say, real soft, "Jonah." I straightened up so fast I nearly slipped on the ice. It was a woman's voice, low and gentle, coming from the edge of the woods about 30 yards off. My first thought was that it might be a neighbor in trouble, but I couldn't think who'd be wandering out there that time of night, especially in that cold. I called out, "Who's there?" But the woods swallowed my voice, and there was no answer. For a moment, I told myself it was just the wind whining through the pines. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Jonah, help me." My scalp prickled all over. The voice didn't sound scared or frantic. It sounded calm, almost too calm. Against my better judgment, I took a few steps toward the trees, my boots crunching in the snow. The moonlight slipped through the bare branches, throwing long black shadows across the ground. I reached the edge of the tree line and stopped, straining my eyes into the dark. That's when I saw a pair of eyes shining back at me, low to the ground, reflecting the light like twin coals. For a split second, I thought it was a coyote, but the shape was all wrong. A red fox stepped forward into the clearing, its fur so bright it looked almost unnatural under the moon. It was larger than any fox I'd ever seen, sleek and muscular, and it kept its gaze locked on mine as it crept closer. And though I know how crazy it sounds, the moment it opened its mouth, I heard the same woman's voice come from deep in its chest. "Jonah, help me." My stomach turned to water. The fox didn't snarl or bare its teeth. It just stared, its eyes glinting like polished stones, and repeated the words one last time, softer than a whisper. Then it turned and trotted back into the woods, leaving nothing but paw prints in the snow. I stood there so long, my fingers went numb, trying to make sense of what I'd seen or heard. By the time I made myself go inside, the fire in the wood stove had burned low, and my coffee had gone cold. I tried telling my cousin about it the next day, but he just laughed and said I'd probably been out in the cold too long. Maybe he's right, but ever since that night, I've kept my ears open, and I never, ever answer when I hear my name called from the trees. Sometimes I swear it's still out there waiting for me. If you like this, stick around. The next tale is even wilder. My name's Everett, and I've been running a small bait and tackle shop near Somersville, West Virginia, for going on 25 years. Folks come in for night crawlers and fishing tips, and sometimes just to swap stories over coffee. I've heard some wild ones in my time, but nothing ever rattled me like what I saw one foggy morning last spring. See, people always talk about what lurks in the deep hollows or high ridges, but they never tell you what might be watching right beneath your feet. It was early April, just after dawn, and the fog lay thick over the river like milk poured slow into coffee. I'd driven down to check my boat, which I keep tied up under a sycamore where the water bends. The world was quiet as a prayer, save for the occasional drip of water off the trees and the distant croak of a bullfrog waking up for the season. I'd just finished inspecting the hull when I noticed ripples breaking the glassy surface near the bank, like something big was moving under there. I figured maybe a beaver or a muskrat, though the pattern looked wrong somehow, more like a coil unwinding. Curious, I stepped closer to the edge, careful on the wet mud. That's when I saw it rise up, an enormous black snake, easily longer than I am tall, slow and deliberate, as it lifted its head out of the water. At first I thought it was just an unusually big rat snake, but its scales shone like wet slate, and its eyes glimmered gold in the weak light, fixed on me in a way no normal snake ever had. It wasn't aggressive, it simply watched me, tongue flicking in and out, as though it were trying to taste the truth of who I was. I stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. I've handled snakes plenty, but this one felt ancient, like it carried the weight of years older than these mountains themselves. The fog swirled around us, muffling sound, and for one wild second I swear I heard something like words in the hiss of the water, low, rhythmic syllables, as if the river itself was whispering secrets through the serpent's mouth. The hair on the back of my neck stood up so sharp it hurt. Then, without warning, the snake dipped its head and glided back beneath the surface, its body vanishing in one smooth motion. The ripples spread out and faded until the river was mirror-still once more. I stood there another 5 minutes, waiting for it to come back, but it never did. Eventually, I made myself walk back to the truck, though my knees felt weak as willow branches in a storm. All day at the shop, I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see that golden-eyed stare watching me from the shadows of the sycamores. I tried telling my friend Darrell about it, but he just chuckled and said, "Big snakes happen, but I know what I saw." And I know how it felt to stand there, certain that something in that river was far older and wiser than me, and maybe not altogether interested in letting me go. Some say the last story is the one that'll keep you awake tonight. In the Ozarks, they always warn you about the cries of a bobcat echoing through the hollows, saying it sounds like a woman screaming bloody murder. But I'm Caleb, 45 years old, and I've lived up here near Johnson City, Tennessee, my whole life. I've heard bobcats plenty of times, and though they'll raise the hair on your arms, you eventually learn not to jump at shadows. I work nights as a security guard at a warehouse off Highway 36, so I'm used to driving empty roads and seeing deer's eyes shine out of the dark. But what I encountered one humid night in July was no bobcat, and it sure wasn't any deer. It was just after midnight, the air thick and buzzing with the sound of cicadas, the road ahead a winding ribbon through the dark. I'd clocked out late and was heading home through the back roads, taking the long way like I often do to clear my head. My truck headlights swept across stands of pine and tangled brush, and every so often the mist would rise off the pavement like breath. About 3 miles from my driveway, I came around a bend and saw a shape crouched low on the asphalt. At first I thought it was a big dog sniffing at something, but as I slowed, it turned its head toward me, and I swear I felt my heart stop. It was a coyote, or that's what it looked like at first glance. But it was enormous, easily the size of a German shepherd, with a thick mane of fur running down its spine and a tail that curled strangely, almost like a wolf's. Its fur was pale grey with odd patches of rusty red, and its eyes reflected an intense, unnatural green. The strangest thing was how it didn't seem startled or afraid of the truck. It just stared at me, its lips twitching as though it wanted to grin. I rolled to a stop, engine idling, my headlights flooding the road in harsh white light. The creature tilted its head, studying me, then opened its mouth and let out a high, yipping cry that sounded eerily close to a child laughing. The sound shot straight through me, sharp and cold, and for a split second I felt dizzy, like my brain was trying to scramble away from the noise. Then the thing dropped back onto all fours and loped off into the woods, vanishing between the trees so fast it was like it dissolved into the shadows. I sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles hurt. The crickets seemed to fall silent all at once, and the only sound was the tick of my engine cooling. When I finally pulled away, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting those glowing green eyes to appear behind me in the dark. The next morning, I went back to check for tracks, but there was nothing on the asphalt except a few scuff marks and a patch of matted weeds at the roadside. I've told a few folks what I saw, but most of them just laugh it off, say I was tired or seeing things in the heat haze, but I know what I saw. And I'll tell you this, I still take the long way home sometimes, but whenever I round that bend, I slow down and watch the shadows, listening for that eerie laugh drifting through the trees. Now I always keep a lantern lit after dark. The next one will send chills down your spine. It was late summer when the cicadas were screaming so loud it felt like the air itself was vibrating. My name's Ruthie, 67 years old, and I've lived alone in these Arkansas woods since my husband passed away. My place sits back off a gravel road near the border where the Ozarks meet the edge of the Appalachians, surrounded by pines and sweet gum trees that rustle like silk when the breeze picks up. I'm used to the quiet, and I've always believed the forest has a rhythm all its own. But there's a night I'll never forget that showed me sometimes the rhythm can skip a beat in the strangest way. I'd been out picking muscadine grapes along the fence line, the air sticky sweet with the smell of ripening fruit and sun-warmed grass. Dusk was coming on fast, and fireflies blinked like tiny lanterns between the vines. I was just about to head inside when I noticed the goats in the pen acting skittish, bunching up in the far corner and stamping their hooves. I called to them soft, trying to soothe them, but they wouldn't settle. That's when I caught sight of movement along the tree line, just where the shadows were thickest. At first, I thought it was a black bear passing through, which happens sometimes this time of year. But as I peered closer, I realized it was smaller than a bear, moving low and smooth, almost like a cat. I held my breath, watching as a creature stepped into the clearing. It was a lynx, or at least it looked like one. Tawny fur, stubby tail, big tufted ears, but it was far larger than any lynx I'd ever seen, standing as high as my waist at the shoulder, and its eyes were a pale, icy blue that glowed even in the fading light. It didn't seem scared of me at all. It padded forward, silent as a drifting leaf, until it was only 10 yards away. Its gaze locked on mine, unblinking, and my whole body went cold, though the night was warm enough to sweat. For a moment it simply stood there, muscles rippling beneath its fur, whiskers twitching like it was tasting the air around me. The goats huddled tighter, bleating softly, and the creature swung its head toward them, as if considering its options. My throat went dry. I wanted to shout or wave my arms, but something in the way it looked at me kept me rooted to the ground. Then slowly, the lynx tilted its head and let out a soft sound, not a growl, not a hiss, but a low chuffing noise, almost like a gentle question. It lingered another few seconds, eyes shining, before it turned and slipped back into the woods, vanishing among the shadows so cleanly that it felt like the trees themselves swallowed it up. I stood there shaking, listening to my own heart thudding in my ears, and the goats finally relaxed enough to start milling around again. When I went back in the house, I couldn't stop replaying the way those blue eyes had stared into me, as though it knew secrets about me I hadn't even told myself. I tried to explain it to my nephew the next day, but he just laughed and said I'd probably seen a big bobcat. But no bobcat ever looked at me like that. Now, whenever I walk out past sundown, I carry a flashlight and keep my eyes on the tree line, half hoping and half dreading I'll see those pale eyes watching me again. Sometimes I swear it's still out there, waiting for the right night to come closer. That was just the beginning. You won't believe what happened next. I've been a truck driver in Montana for over 20 years, but nothing prepared me for what I saw on Highway 93 when I decided to cut across the southern edge of the Appalachians on my way to Georgia. My name's Donnie, 54, divorced twice, and happier alone behind the wheel than just about anywhere else. I've driven through snowstorms, tornado warnings, and roads so dark you'd swear the stars were the only witnesses to your passing. But one night last fall, rolling through western North Carolina, I found out there's still things on this earth that'll make even a seasoned driver question his own eyes. It was close to midnight, and the road was empty except for me and the hum of my diesel engine. I'd been cruising a long stretch where the highway winds between ridges, black trees crowding in close, the scent of pine thick enough to taste. My CB had gone quiet for the past hour, and my eyelids were starting to droop, so I cracked the window for some cool air. That's when my headlights caught something standing right at the edge of the asphalt, a pair of glowing eyes set far higher off the ground than any deer or bear I'd ever seen. I eased off the throttle, heart pounding, trying to make out the shape. As I rolled closer, the creature stepped fully into the light. It was a massive elk, or that's what it resembled at first glance, but taller and leaner, with legs long as fence posts and a neck stretched higher than seemed natural. Its fur was a patchwork of dark chestnut and pale cream, and its antlers were twisted into spirals like corkscrews, glistening as if wet. But the part that made me break into a cold sweat was its eyes. They were pale silver, almost luminescent, and they didn't blink. Just stared right through my windshield like it could see me inside my own head. The truck coasted to a crawl. I couldn't bring myself to hit the horn, afraid it might charge. Instead, I whispered under my breath, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The creature tilted its head, almost curious, and I swear I felt a pressure in the cab, like the air was pressing in on me. A few seconds passed, where the world felt completely still. No engine noise, no wind, not even the usual hiss of my tires on the pavement. Then, as smooth as a ghost, the animal turned and stepped off the highway, disappearing into the trees so fast it was like the darkness swallowed it whole. When it was gone, sound rushed back all at once, the rumble of my engine, the wind whistling through the cracked window, the blood pounding in my ears. I sat there idling in the middle of Highway 93, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or a big elk that wandered too far east. But I've seen elk. None of them stand 10 feet tall or stare at you like they know your name. I finished the drive with every hair on my neck standing straight up, and even now, whenever I run a load through those mountains, I find myself slowing down on that same stretch, scanning the roadside for silver eyes hidden among the trees. To this day, I'm not sure what I saw. If you thought this was intense, wait until you hear the next story. It's unbelievable. My name's Ellen, and ever since I retired from teaching 3rd grade, I've been living alone in a little house tucked into the hills outside Asheville, North Carolina. I'm 62, fond of knitting and birdwatching, and most evenings you'll find me sitting on the porch with a mug of chamomile tea, listening to the whip-poor-wills calling through the dusk. Folks say these mountains are full of wonders and old secrets, but I always figured that was just talk to pass the time. Until the night I learned firsthand how true it might be. It was early November, with a chill in the air, and the trees half bare, their leaves piled like rust-colored snowdrifts along the driveway. I'd stepped outside to bring in a wind chime that kept banging against the porch rail when I noticed a flicker of movement down by the garden fence. I squinted into the darkness, thinking maybe it was a raccoon raiding my compost pile again. But then the motion resolved itself into a shape, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing just inside the circle of my solar lights was a barred owl, but not like any I'd ever seen. It was enormous, nearly as tall as my hip, with feathers so white they seemed to glow faintly, even in the shadows. Its big, dark eyes were fixed on me, and the air between us felt charged somehow, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The owl didn't hoot or flap its wings. It simply stood there completely still, the slight breeze ruffling the down around its face like a halo. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the porch light, making it look bigger than it was. But as I edged closer, I saw that its talons were gripping the top rail of the fence, digging into the wood with a strength that seemed impossible for a bird. Then it opened its beak and let out a sound I'll never forget, a deep, resonant whistle, almost like a human breath passing through a flute. The note hung in the cold air, rising and falling in a pattern that felt deliberate, as if it was trying to speak. For a moment, I felt as though the owl and I were the only two beings in the world. My chest went tight, and I felt tears prickling at my eyes, though I couldn't have said why. Then, without warning, it unfurled its wings broader than my outstretched arms, and launched itself into the air. I felt the rush of wind across my face as it flew over me, so close I could feel the brush of its wingtips. It vanished into the trees, leaving me standing there trembling, my wind chime still swinging slowly in my hand. I stayed outside another few minutes, listening for the sound of its wings, but the woods had gone utterly silent. The next day, I tried telling my neighbor, Mrs. Hollis, about what I'd seen. She patted my arm and said I'd probably just spotted a big snowy owl passing through. But snowy owls don't whistle like flutes, and they certainly don't look at you like they're trying to tell you the world's oldest secrets. Now, when I sit on my porch after sunset, I keep my eyes on the fence line, half hoping that owl might return. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I hear that same haunting whistle drifting out of the trees. This was nothing compared to the next tale. Some folks say it'll give you chills. It was an ordinary Wednesday when I went out to check the water trough for my cows, and I figured the biggest surprise I'd get was finding a possum dunked in there again. My name's Harvey, 59 years old, and I've been raising cattle outside Hazard, Kentucky, on the same patch of land my daddy farmed before me. Life's simple out here. Fences to mend, hay to cut, and a sky so wide some days it feels like you could fall right into it. But one muggy evening last July, I came face to face with something I can't explain, and it still makes the hair stand up on my arms when I think about it. The sun was sinking low, throwing long orange streaks across the pastures, and the cows were clustered near the fence, flicking their tails at flies. The air smelled of dust, warm grass, and the faint tang of manure. I'd gone to the trough with a 5-gallon bucket because the pump had been acting up, leaving the water level low. As I rounded the corner of the shed, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was something already drinking from the trough, a creature so strange I thought for a second my eyes were playing tricks on me. At first, all I saw was its back, sleek, dark fur glistening under the last rays of sun, and shoulders hunched high like a panther's. But when it lifted its head, my knees nearly buckled. Its face was long and narrow, more like a horse's than any cat, with big eyes that glowed gold in the fading light. Long whiskers framed its snout, and when it opened its mouth to lap the water, I saw a flicker of a pale, forked tongue. Its ears were rounded, twitching constantly, and its forelegs were muscular, tipped with thick curved claws that dug into the metal rim of the trough. I stood frozen, heart hammering so loud I was sure it'd spook the cows. The creature blinked at me, calm as you please, and kept drinking, the sound of its tongue lapping echoing in the hush of the pasture. There was something almost polite about it. It was a guest who meant no harm. But every part of me screamed that this thing didn't belong here. After a few seconds it pulled back, sniffed the air, and let out a low, purring rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath my boots. Then, smooth as silk, it turned and bounded over the fence in one fluid leap, landing silent as a ghost on the other side. The cows bawled and scattered, their hooves thudding against the earth, and I stood there gripping my bucket so tight the plastic creaked. When I finally gathered my wits enough to follow, there wasn't a trace of it. No tracks, no broken grass, nothing but the soft buzz of crickets as the night came down around me. I tried telling my brother about it the next morning, but he just laughed and said I'd probably seen a mangy mountain lion. But no mountain lion's got a face like a horse or a tongue like a snake. Now, every time I go out to check the trough at dusk, I bring a flashlight and keep my ears open, listening for the faintest sound of claws on metal. Sometimes, I swear I hear that low purr rumbling out of the shadows. That was just the beginning. You won't believe what happened next. People say the deserts of Texas hold secrets. I learned that the hard way one quiet night, but what I saw years later here in the Appalachians put that old memory to shame. My name's Louise, 50, and after a divorce that left me wanting a fresh start, I moved up to the hills outside Wytheville, Virginia. I've got a small cabin, a rescue dog named Buddy, and a love for hiking the narrow trails that twist through these ridges like veins. I've always thought the forest was a place of peace. That belief cracked one crisp morning in October. I'd set out at dawn, the world still silver with frost, my breath puffing clouds in front of me. Buddy was trotting ahead, nose to the ground, ears flicking with every rustle in the underbrush. The trail climbed steep between groves of beech and tulip poplar, sunlight trickling through the leaves in soft gold ribbons. Everything smelled clean and sharp, a mix of cold soil and dry leaves. About 2 miles in, Buddy froze, his body stiff, tail low. He gave a low growl I'd never heard from him before, deep and warning. At first I thought it might be a bear, but then I saw movement up the slope, a shape picking its way down between the trees, silent as a shadow. It looked like a deer, tall and slender, with a grayish-brown hide. But as it stepped into the patchy sunlight, I felt my chest tighten. Its legs were far too long, joints bending just a little too sharply. The skin along its ribs seemed stretched thin, as though it were half-starved, and its neck curved in an unnatural S-shape. Worst of all were its eyes, huge and dark, with a strange glossy sheen, like black marbles glinting in the sun. Buddy barked once, sharp and frightened, but the creature didn't spook. Instead, it raised its head and sniffed the air, ears flicking, gaze fixed right on me. A chill raced through me, because in that stare was something more than animal curiosity. It felt like recognition, as though it knew me somehow. My legs wobbled under me, and I clutched Buddy's collar, holding him back. The creature tilted its head slowly from side to side, studying us, and then opened its mouth, not to bleat or snort like a deer, but to produce this soft, raspy sound, almost like a person trying to speak through dry leaves. The noise twisted my gut. Buddy was whining and trying to back away, trembling all over. I swallowed hard, whispering, "Easy, boy," though I could barely hear my own voice over the thudding in my ears. After a few seconds that felt like a lifetime, the creature turned and glided back up the slope, weaving between tree trunks so fast and smooth it seemed to vanish into the shadows. The forest fell silent, as if all the birds and insects had stopped breathing. I stood there, shaking, gripping Buddy's fur like a lifeline. Eventually we turned around and headed back toward the cabin, moving faster than I care to admit. That night, I sat up late by the wood stove, replaying that stare in my mind. I tried telling myself it was just a sick deer, maybe with mange or some deformity, but deep down, I know better. Nothing that thin and long-limbed, and certainly nothing with eyes like that, belongs in these woods. Now, whenever I hike alone, I keep to open trails, and Buddy never strays far. And sometimes, when the wind rustles the leaves just so, I hear that raspy, leaf-dry whisper calling out from the shadows. My name's Franklin, and I've spent all my 65 years deep in the heart of the Appalachian hills outside Roanoke, Virginia. Folks around here know me as a woodworker and part-time fiddler, a man who keeps to himself, but has a good word for anybody who stops by my porch. These mountains have always been my refuge, the trees standing watch like old friends, the streams singing the same songs my granddaddy heard. I've seen my share of odd sights over the years, strange lights, weird tracks, the distant calls of animals no one else seemed to hear. But nothing prepared me for the night I found out the forest might be watching back. It was early November, the leaves mostly fallen and rattling across my porch like dry paper. I'd been up late in my workshop, finishing a cedar jewelry box for my niece's wedding. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil still clung to my shirt as I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The moon was hanging low and bright, silvering the frost that coated every blade of grass. My breath floated out in clouds, and the whole hollow was quiet, the way it gets just before a snowstorm rolls in. I was about to head back inside when I heard a low rustling coming from the edge of the yard, where the pines start thickening into forest. At first I figured it was just a deer nosing around, but then a shape stepped into the moonlight, and my heart climbed right up into my throat. Standing there, half hidden among the shadows, was a black bear, or that's what my eyes tried to tell me. But this creature was wrong in too many ways. It was enormous, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, with shoulders broad as a bull's and fur so black it seemed to drink in the moonlight rather than reflect it. Its eyes were the color of molten amber, fixed on me without blinking. And the longer I stared, the more I realized there was something strangely human about the set of its shoulders, the way it carried its massive head, cocked slightly to one side as if curious. I stood frozen on my porch, gripping the railing, too afraid to move or even breathe loud. The creature slowly lowered itself onto all fours and began moving toward me, silent as smoke drifting across water. Each step seemed deliberate, as though it were testing how close it could come without driving me to panic. When it got within 20 feet, it paused, lifted its head, and sniffed the air. Then it made a low, throaty sound that was somewhere between a growl and a rumbling chant. The sound vibrated through the boards under my boots, and I felt it deep in my chest, like the bass line of a song you can't quite hear. What happened next is something I've tried to explain a dozen different ways, but the words always fall short. The creature leaned back on its haunches, eyes locked on mine, and I felt the strongest impression that it was trying to communicate. Not through words exactly, but through some silent force that pressed into my mind like a gentle but insistent hand. Images flickered through my thoughts. Deep green forests untouched by man, rivers running clear and fast, a sense of age so vast it made me feel like a single grain of sand. It was beautiful and terrifying, because woven into those visions was something else too, a warning, as sharp and cold as the mountain wind. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the creature lowered its massive head, turned, and melted back into the trees without a sound. The shadows swallowed it whole, leaving only the silver frost glittering on the grass where it had stood. I stayed on the porch for a long while, listening to my own ragged breathing, half expecting it to reappear. Eventually, I went back inside, locked the door, and sat in my shop with all the lights blazing, unable to shake the feeling that I'd been marked somehow, chosen to see something most folks weren't meant to witness. I tried telling my neighbor about it the next day, but he just laughed and said I'd been working too many late nights. Maybe he's right. But since that night, I keep a lantern burning on the porch, and when the wind rattles the pines, I sometimes think I hear that low, chanting growl drifting through the darkness. Sometimes I swear it's still out there, waiting for the night I finally understand what it was trying to tell me. And that's the last of my tales, for now anyway. Thanks so much for sticking around and listening to these stories from deep in the Appalachian hills. If you enjoyed this journey through strange and wild encounters, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join me for the next round of mysterious backwoods tales. Trust me, there's plenty more waiting in the shadows.